The Pan-African Parliament has denounced external actors who are fueling terror activities in the northern parts of Mozambique. One of the motions tabled before the House calls for those responsible for terrorism to refrain from doing so. SADC has deployed troops to stabilise the Cabo Delgado province, where terrorism is centred. At the same time, the Pan-African Parliament has wrapped up its work for the year.
We are deeply concerned about certain UN members that are financing, arming and instigating terrorism, notably in Mozambique. And we are saying that these instigators are members of the United Nations, which is the guardian of international peace and security. And now we believe that what is happening in Mozambique threatens, impedes the right of the people of Mozambique to social and economic development. But we also believe that this matter, this problem, because it is caused by member states of the UN, this matter is an international problem.
The Pan-African Parliament has meanwhile also resolved that a high-level team will be set up to meet with the European Union and the United Nations to address the sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. It says sanctions should be the last resort to resolve differences. Researcher and political analyst Ringisai Chikohomero joins us to speak about this. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So there's been a consistent denial from the West that the sanctions are affecting the people in Zimbabwe in general and the region, and not only the oligarchs. But what has the PAP heard, or in general the region heard, about why this is not true?
Good evening, and thank you for having me. Apologies for the load shedding on my side. So there's been a binary approach to the narrative around the sanctions in Zimbabwe and their effect on the ordinary citizen. And what is unfortunate is what is playing out on the international arena is who has the best advocates to articulate their narrative, and who has the best ear to key figures. And the Zimbabwean government seems, for now, to be winning with regards to its diplomatic offensive at the regional and continental level. And they're pushing the narrative that the sanctions that have been in place since around 2001 from the United States, the EU, and the United Kingdom are the sole causes of the economic crisis and suffering in Zimbabwe, which is not exactly true. So the part that has not been sufficiently given airplay is the side where Zimbabwe, by the time the sanctions in place in 2000, was already in economic doldrums, and Zimbabwe was already struggling. Its currency had lost about 70% of its value way before the sanctions had been imposed on the country. And then a number of policy instances, bad governance and corruption have really been at the core of the suffering of the people of Zimbabwe.
So, I mean, Chief Charumbira earlier on calling the sanctions unjustified, but obviously, as you've mentioned, detractors to this position argue that the EU, the UK and the US imposed the sanctions on Zimbabwe because of gross human rights violations of human rights. Now, you say it's not entirely true. So that means at some point we need to balance the fact that these occurred in some cases, but that sanctions may not necessarily be the right instrument for the poor in society who actually suffered abuses. So there's an acknowledgement that it stunts development, but you say in an environment where it was already stunted by some policies.
Yes, so you have to acknowledge that ZANU, the ruling party in Zimbabwe, is really dexterous at a diplomatic offensive, and by positioning people like Chief Fortune Charumbira at the head of the Pan-African Parliament, it's actually a win on their part. But the reality of the matter is, by 1999. There's 1997, November 1997, actually, the Zimbabwean dollar lost 70% of its value. By 1999, the IMF had already begun processes of suspending Zimbabwe from its accessing its resources. The International Development Association and the Paris Club had already begun processes of withdrawing financial support to Zimbabwe because it was seen as a bad debtor. You can argue that by the time the sanctions came, the economy was on its knees, and the sanctions already fell into a system that was already crashing. But that is not to deny that the ordinary citizen has seen some level of impact of the sanctions, especially in terms of trying to transact internationally. If they are trying to pay school fees for yourself, or you're trying to access any international financial instruments at a very individual level, there are still banks and institutions that will not transact with Zimbabwe by virtue of the risk premium placed on the country by the sanctions and by the optics created by the over-compliance that the United States places on its Office of Financial Control. At the same time, the EU and the UK actually have nominal sanctions at the moment. There are only 5 people on this United Kingdom sanctions list, the same with the EU, and 1 company. And these people have been clearly designated as people who have been at the forefront of inflicting human rights abuses in Zimbabwe, and emanating from the 1st of August 2018 killing of 7 civilians by the military soon after the elections. And no one has really wanted to discuss this bit, especially from the African side, the AU and the SADC side, which really leaves a sour taste that there's a level of ingenious from these bodies where they are willing to ignore the blatant abuses for as long as they can peddle a narrative that is seen as pan-African and anti-imperialism. And that is the kind of dichotomy that one has to deal with when they're looking at the perilous case of the sanctions on Zimbabwe.
So the US says with election season in full swing in Zimbabwe and political violence making a brutal comeback, as it categorizes as, that the country has done little to reverse the conditions that first led to the imposition of sanctions, that is Zimbabwe. Can you share your thoughts on this, and if continuing subjugation of the oppositions, or those seen as against the government, and as you say, it needs to be contextualized and nuanced, that will see sanctions continue, because I mean, the Zimbabwean government says there must be meaningful and noticeable material actions to strengthen democratic process. It agrees with that, but building institutions and respecting the Constitution cannot necessarily be said to be tantamount with, you know, the conditions outlined in the sanctions.
Well, so when you look at the issue of elections, as has been said, sanctions by the United States, it has been contentious ever since independence in Zimbabwe. But in recent years, Zimbabwe has been floating the regional guidelines, the SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections. They've been floating even the AU guidelines on how to manage and operate democratic elections. There is still very limited space for active citizen participation. There's very limited space for ordinary citizens, especially in the rural areas, to access alternative media voices. And then the state media itself does not provide airplay at all to the opposition and alternative voices. So you are getting into an election season where the citizen is ill-informed or is only half informed of the reality that they are facing every day. Already this makes the electoral playing field uneven. We have already seen a lot of arbitrary arrests, weaponization of the law against the opposition in many instances. We have seen the over-compliance required on the part of the opposition if they are to hold rallies, if they are to try and penetrate rural areas to galvanize and mobilize support for their citizens. All these are very clear. They're not being hidden. Now, what is problematic is when African states, when the Pan-African Parliament does not offer an alternative to say, okay, there is this problem of sanctions that have been imposed on for 20 years now. And there's a problem in terms of governance, in terms of human rights space, in terms of civics participation. But what can we do? We as the Pan-African Parliament, we're offering an alternative approach to handling or to processing the conflict to what the United States said. What I think it would be a mistake is to say there's unconditional lifting of sanctions without a concomitant acknowledgement of the crisis that has necessitated the imposition of sanctions in the first place. You will note that actually today, the former president of Nigeria, President Obasanjo, has said something to the effect that the wave of coups that is sprawling all over Africa can be traced back to the Zimbabwean military-assisted transition of 2017, which was never resolved in terms of political and legal standing internationally.
All right,
and this has created some sort of impunity.
A very interesting point, and I wish we had time to continue with it, but I'm sure we will make time to do that. Ringisai Chikohomero, who's a research and political analyst, and of course the Zimbabwean government says it's lost more than tens of billions of US dollars in revenue, some of which includes a lost bilateral donor support.